also have some questions too.
Thank you, Senator Steele. My questions relate to the issue of antimicrobial resistance, and I'm interested in the follow-up from the 1998 JEDICA report, that is the Joint Expert Technical Advisory Committee on Antibiotic Resistance, and some of the recommendations that have come out of that report and whether they've been followed up, and specifically the role of the department in their implementation. Just as a sort of general introduction, do you agree with the conclusions of many experts in this area, for example, the Australian Society of Infectious Diseases and Professor Lindsay Grayson, that we have an enormous issue when it comes to and growing issue when it comes to antibiotic resistance, and that in fact the role of antibiotics in animal use are playing a part in that? And I'm happy for those questions to be taken by whoever it's most appropriate for.
Okay. Maybe I can just make some introductory comments and then pass over to Dr. Bryce. Senator, we obviously the issue of antimicrobial resistance is not unique to Australia. It's an international problem and an issue, and so most of our activities relate to being part of that international agenda, taking part in conferences, working groups, and keeping at the forefront of how other regulatory systems are approaching this issue, and working with our colleagues within Australia too. There's a number of other areas that work in this area, Department of Health in terms of human antimicrobial resistance issues, to always make sure that our regulatory framework is in line with how other regulators and other regulatory systems are dealing with this problem. But I may pass to Alan Bryce for more specific questions.
Senator, I'll just say, yes, we're very well aware that use of antibiotics in livestock in particular, but in animals in general, is an issue in terms of development of antibiotic resistance in humans. It's debatable as to how important it is compared to the development of antibiotic resistance in human medicine, but certainly we are keeping on top of international developments. One of our strongest, almost critics, I'll say, is Dr. Peter Kalinian from Canberra, who is often alerting us to this issue. And he has, on many occasions, recently said how Australia is leading the world in terms of its limitations and the use of particularly fluoroquinolones in livestock, and that's one of the reasons that we have far fewer problems with fluoroquinolone resistance in Australia than overseas. The same applies with cephalosporins, where we also restrict the use in livestock of another class that's really important in human medicine.
I think I take your point about ensuring that our regulatory standards are consistent with international approaches, but I think JEDICA made it clear that monitoring and surveillance here in Australia was also critical. So a few questions about that in terms of whether, firstly, you see your role as coordinating the Australian effort in terms of ensuring that we bring together all the relevant data relating to antimicrobial resistance in animals. Is that how the department, and particularly yourselves, see your role?
Our role is really in terms of the supply and the use of the chemicals. So we're part of, if you like, a bigger group of people who play a role in this. So that our powers only extend so far as what we can do that's described in our governing legislation, which is doing assessments of the risks of the use of a chemical in Australia, which includes risks to human health, and it includes a risk assessment of the potential for the use of antibiotics in food-producing animals to cause unintended risks to human health through antibiotic resistance. So that's the extent to how the work that we can do, and that includes in terms of monitoring and surveillance. Our role in monitoring and surveillance, which is what we do, is collect data on the supply of the amount of chemical that's supplied within Australia. But there are obviously other roles in terms of actually who does monitoring and surveillance in terms of what resistant strains might be out in the field. That is not directly the APVMA's role.
Okay, so whose role is it to coordinate all of this information around the use of antibiotics in animals? Is there a central agency who has responsibility for that?
Well, I'm not. As I said, we're responsible for the chemicals. Then you have, the department has also been involved in some aspects of the GEDICAR report when it was being produced and in developing the recommendations to it. It's more of a cross-agency role that we see. We're part of a role of a bigger picture, but as far as I'm aware, there is no one particular body that oversights it.
Senator, the one large survey that was done into antimicrobial resistance since the GEDICAR report was conducted by the Department of Agriculture.
I suppose I'm asking this specifically because GEDICAR said that there was a lack of comprehensive centralised monitoring systems when it comes to the use of antibiotics in animals, and I just want to get a sense of whether we've actually come some way to developing that system, or rather we're continuing on with the sort of ad hoc approach that one agency is responsible for dispensing the chemicals and there's no real oversight in terms of the impact of that in the field.
Yeah, I'll say that the APVMA has taken on the job of collecting information on the sales of antibiotics for veterinary use. This is a different question though than the question you were asking about surveillance of antimicrobial resistance.
So you don't play any role in collecting and analysing the results of testing for residues or, for example, of the emergence of antimicrobial resistance amongst bacteria or so on?
That's correct.
So who does that?
Senator Matthew Goodall, First Assistant Secretary in Agricultural Productivity Division. Dr Bryce mentioned that there was a survey done, I think it was 2003-04. I'm not aware of a survey done since then, but I'm happy to take that on notice and have a look at that. The department does, in terms of testing for residues of products, we do that through our residue survey, which looks at antibiotics. I'm not quite sure. I'll have to go and talk to the relevant people in either our food division or our animal biosecurity division about whether or not that then is looked from the point of view of resistance. But as Dr Bennett-Jenkins mentioned, it's a whole of government thing, and it's done across portfolios, and when a new antibiotic is considered for use in animals, the Department of Health and Ageing look at it. They do an antimicrobial risk assessment, and the Department of Health and Ageing very, very conscious of the impact on human health, and in their advice to APVMA, I'm sure that's considered. But I'll have to go take it on notice about actually how detailed our analysis is within the department for you.
Okay, I look forward to that. Let me ask about a few things, like, for example, off-label use, where a drug is given for or prescribed in a way that's outside the guidelines for that substance. So, for example, I understand that in veterinary practice it's not illegal to prescribe a drug that might be registered for one class of animals, for example, cattle, in another class, for example, other food-producing animals, pigs, sheep, etc. That be correct?
As a general rule, if it's registered for use in a major food-producing species, it may be used off-label in another food-producing species, but each of the states has restrictions on the use, and in many states it's in some states it's only possible to use it on one individual animal in a herd on a particular day. In some of the other states, it's only possible to use it you can use it in more than one animal, but each animal has to be diagnosed by the veterinarian as requiring that treatment.
Do we know how widespread this practice is? I mean, what sort of auditing's done to look at the use of off-label medicines in agriculture?
The states control the use of veterinary medicines in agriculture, and the APVMA doesn't have a role in terms of monitoring the use.
So there's no sense of whether this is widespread at a national level. There's no national body that would be able to get any sort of indication about whether off-label use is increasing or not?
We certainly talk with the Australian Veterinary Association, for example, to get information from them, and we have external experts that we rely on for information about use in veterinary practice, but the APVMA doesn't have a direct role there in monitoring off-label
so
use.
we just don't have really a comprehensive national picture about what's happening in each state? Would be fair to say?
That's a reasonable comment, I think.
Okay. Given that Jedicar said very specifically that we need to ensure that there are appropriate and enforceable restrictions on off-label use because of the potential impact on antimicrobial resistance, is there anything that you've done in terms of your practice that's changed as a result of that recommendation? Can you point to any specific measure you've implemented to ensure that we do get more enforceable and comprehensive restrictions around off-label use?
Well, Senator, for those antibiotics that are regarded as of high importance for human medicine, there are restrictions on their use, and there are restrictions that prevent off-label use for some of them, and particularly, for example, for the cephalosporins, which are not, which have a restraint on the label. The restraint is not a limitation that you can just that a veterinarian can use their prescribing rights to circumvent. A restraint is essentially a prohibition, and restraints on use of cephalosporins say it's not to be used for mass medication and not to be used by a number of different routes of administration, so that the circumstance where you're looking at a large number of animals being treated in a particular herd or flock should not arise.
Well, that's true for cephalosporins, but it may not be true for other drugs which don't have that restraint, and where it's possible that off-label use would allow it to be used in a circumstance other than which the drug was designed for.
That's correct, and those precautions are always determined according to the risk and the importance of the antibiotic for use in human medicine.
But it's fair to say that the guidelines exist because we accept that this is best practice, and my concern is that we don't have any sense about the scale of off-label use.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure which guidelines you mean, but...
Well, a drug's registered for a particular purpose.
Yes.
And if it's used for a purpose other than that for which it's registered, one, I think, can say that essentially that means that we're not following the best or perhaps most appropriate use of that drug in that circumstance.
Well, you could say that the use hasn't been fully assessed for use in that circumstance, yeah.
Okay. And do you think it would be worthwhile having a better picture, a clearer picture about how widespread off-label use is in terms of the question of antimicrobial resistance?
Yes, it may well be, but I don't think it would necessarily affect the APVMA's decision on registration or on label restraints.
A question about the issue of definitions, in that I think I asked a question on notice at last estimates around the purpose of a drug and trying to distinguish between growth promotant, prophylactic or therapeutic. And I think in the question or the answer I received, there was an indication that those categories may not necessarily be as clear as one would like. again, I'm returning to Jedicar, where I think they made a very clear distinction between prophylaxis and therapeutic use. And I suppose my question is, do you agree? I'm happy to provide you with the definitions. Do you agree with the definitions in Jedicar as to how they're applied? Is that something you would...
Yeah, I think there's, the Jedicar report makes a clear distinction between therapeutic and prophylactic use, as you've said. But the boundaries between growth promotant use and prophylactic use are not as clear. We'll shortly be releasing a report of the sales of antibiotic products over the 5 years from 2005 to 2010, and in putting that report together, we found that there are some products where there is use for both growth promotant and prophylactic use, and therefore there's a grey area where we can't be sure for those individual products in what way they're used. So you're quite right, there is a grey area between growth promotants and prophylactic use.
Couple of questions about aquaculture. Who do I direct those to? Can I just general questions around the issue? Sorry.
Aquaculture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, last ones.
Yep. I would ask because I've got to go to Senator Colbeck.
Thank you.
As well.
I'm interested in because it is an emerging area, the issue of testing in locally farmed seafood. In particular, what sort of testing is done for unlicensed antimicrobials? Do we get what sort of testing regimes apply?
Well, in terms of testing, it's not the APVMA's role to conduct testing in terms of in aquaculture.
So who does that?
Will be part of the testing that's done by either the department here or states and territories.
I mean, I'm particularly interested in this area because aquaculture is one of those emerging areas where there is a lot of off-label use of antimicrobials. There are concerns around the potential for antimicrobial resistance, of course, in aquaculture. So I'd like to know a little bit more about the testing regime. How's that done? Do we test for residues on fish? And do we test for resistant bacteria?
Senator, we can probably take that on notice. Aquaculture is by and far carried out in state waters. So the Commonwealth doesn't have a direct responsibility over those areas of activity, but we can take that on notice and see what we can find out for you.
So again, there wouldn't be a clear national picture emerging from this area? Would that be fair to say?
Not to my knowledge, but we can confirm that.
Okay. Has there been any assessment of some of the environmental impacts of the use of antibiotics in aquaculture?
Certainly, it would be a question probably worth pursuing with the Department of Sustainability, Environment, Water, Population and Communities, where a particular aquacultural activity was going to have an impact on a matter of national environmental significance. They would take those matters into account. But similarly, we can chase that up for you.
Okay. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank
If I
you,
may,
Senator.
I can also add to that, sorry, to give some more information to that question. Before we allow any use of antibiotics in aquaculture, if we issue a permit for large-scale use, we do an environmental risk assessment.
Okay. And can I just, last question, do you have any role in imported seafood?
No.
No, I didn't think so. I just wanted to be clear about that. Thank you. Yeah, I thought so.